Hi everyone. We'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. And while we're doing that, just as last time, I will share here a poll everywhere link, so you can tell us how you're feeling today in just a second. So the link to the survey is right at the top, as you can see it, paulev.com/security-webinar. Well, great. We see more green than, well, I guess depending on what part of the day in the world you are at. Here it's morning in Redmond, Washington, and I guess mood depends on the time of the day. Well, let's get started. I'm gonna share Offer's screen here in a second. Offer, if you don't mind sharing that,
I'll share.
Thank you, sir. Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valon Kalika, and I will be your host for today. So just a few reminders before kicking off this webinar. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser version of Teams, please refresh your browser. If you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Also, closed captions are available during this live broadcast. You can enable it by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. During this time, please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask Question button. And be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. Now, we often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. And we're also running a same format as before. Not sure if some of you attended our last August Sentinel webinar, but we will conduct the same type of same link I will be providing you of Poll Everywhere, Poll EV, where you can actually directly ask a question to the presenter and or upvote the questions from others. So the best way to ensure that you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements is by connecting with us through at aka.ms/security-community. Our community can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews. You can sign up for that at aka.ms/security private preview. And while you're there, you can request features, you can give feedback, review our product roadmaps, attend in-person events, or join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by simply removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. Today, Ofer will take us through the log forwarder, filtering CEF and Syslog events using Azure Sentinel. Ofer Shazaf, as many of you know, he's our senior principal program manager with our Azure Sentinel team. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ofer. Ofer, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Valon. One question, Valon, just to make sure. I think we are light on people answering questions today. So I do want to forewarn you. We may be slow, and also you may have not noticed, but when a few days after we publish initially the webinar, we add to the slides Q&A, so we make sure that all questions go answered in the deck itself. Go back to previous webinars, at least those I presented, and you'll find the answers. And as usual, as Valon mentioned, the community is always a great way if you didn't get your question answered.
That's a great
also
call.
Yeah, also I did not blog about this webinar yet, so there's no document version of it. I will do it in the near future. We'll go today deeply into the log forwarder, which is a relatively new name that we coined for the box, the connector box that we use to forward events from Syslog and CEF sources. We'll go over a bit about collection in general in Sentinel. That would not be new, but anybody who have not used Sentinel before will appreciate it. We'll do an overview of the CEF Syslog Log Forwarder itself. We'll understand its internals, and then we'll start playing around with it. I would like to show you a few tools that will make it easier for you to work with Linux. If you are a Linux buff, you might not appreciate, but many of you come from the Windows world, so I think those will make the task of working with a Linux box easier. We'll then just briefly mention how you install the log forwarder and how you troubleshoot installation as well as configuration, getting us to the last part where we'll actually talk about custom configuration and we'll talk about, for example, how you can filter events prior to sending them to Azure Sentinel. So starting with an overview and getting deeper and deeper into technical capabilities and the power features you can use. I jumped over this one. Many of you may know by now, this webinar is part of a series. Valon has helped me create many of them. We have others doing additional webinars as well. They're all collected, curated in the Ninja training. This is the link to the Ninja training, which is an organized way to learn more and get yourself educated on Azure Sentinel. This specific webinar will be added to module number 4, which is about connectivity and collecting events. Okay, I'll start with slides because it's overviews to begin with, but after the overviews, you'll see that I'll go into a much more interactive well, interactive is the wrong term, demo-oriented session. We'll go into tools. We'll look into how actual command lines. I hope that the slides would still be useful to you. So collection overview. Azure Sentinel, for those who don't know, I guess if you came here, you know that, is a cloud-native SIEM. It lives in the cloud. It lives as part of the Azure portal, though. It's important to mention that it does not rely on you being an Azure user. You can be an Azure Sentinel user as your SIEM without using any other Azure feature. As a SIEM, it has to collect data. And in this slide, I'm focusing not on collecting from cloud sources, which is a different aspect, but on collecting from on-prem sources where Syslog and CEF are important capabilities. The first way in which Azure Sentinel can collect data from on-prem or cloud-based VMs is using the log analytics agent. The log analytics agent is installed on servers or clients, Linux or Windows, and is able to collect Windows events or Linux syslog events, as well as other streams of data, including, for example, DNS, Windows firewalls, and even files stored on those servers. But this is not the focus of discussion today. Today, we want to talk about remote collection using CEF or Syslog, in which a log forwarder machine, which we'll discuss in depth today, is used to collect events which are received over the Syslog protocol from other systems, whether networking devices, security devices, or other Linux systems. You can actually even use Syslog to collect from Windows by using third-party systems such as NXLog, which can send Windows events using Syslog. So this will be the focus of the discussion today, but I do want to mention a few other options before we move on. For Windows events, while I mentioned Syslog, the preferred way is a WEF, Windows Event Forwarding, using a server that collects Windows events from other Windows systems and forward them to Azure Sentinel. We also support Logstash as an alternative to our log forwarder. Many customers are accustomed to Logstash, prefer to use it, and therefore, for the same use case as you can see in the slide used by our log forwarder, you can use Logstash. Most of these technologies can actually be used also on the cloud. Most all of them. It can be on-prem or on the cloud. I did present here a use case in which you may want to actually deploy the Syslog or CEF log forwarder in the cloud, say in Azure, and deliver from an on-prem facility. Might be a small office, branch office, where there is no servers to collect to, so you can collect directly to the cloud. I'll talk a bit more in a second about the security of that. Lastly, beyond those, there are additional ways to collect, such as custom connectors or systems that know how to directly send data to Azure Sentinel. Last but not least, a bit because it's new, at least private links here, a bit about the security of collection. We have a few elements that can help you secure this collection infrastructure. The first one, which is a rather veteran one, is the log analytics proxy, which enables different agents or log forwarders not to connect directly to the internet to reach Azure Sentinel, but rather through a proxy that we provide. The second new feature that we introduced is private link. Private link enables you to collect from agents or CEF or Syslog log forwarders, which reside in a private VNet in Azure, directly to Azure Sentinel without ever crossing to the public internet. This is a relatively new feature that was introduced recently and enhance the security of collection if you do not want to go through the internet at all. This can also be used if you want to collect without ever crossing the internet from on-prem by using ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute will enable you to connect privately to the cloud, and from the cloud you can continue through a private link to Azure Sentinel. Anyways, as we discussed, today we focus here. So, since I mentioned in a few minutes a large variety of options to connect to Azure Sentinel, we have a number of lists which will enable you to know what can be connected to Azure Sentinel. Importantly, the list is much larger than the growing fast but still not very long list of, I think, 50-something connectors in the connector gallery in the product. So for those sources that are fully supported but are not in the gallery, you'll have those lists. The most important one is the grand list, which now includes all sources, not all, there are always more, that we have curated that you can connect to Azure Sentinel. Those include today also the more specific list of Microsoft sources, as well as sources that the Log agent can collect. And lastly, you may want to review how to do custom collection if nothing else works. So that was a general overview of collection in Azure Sentinel. Now let's go into the CEF and Syslog Log Forwarder. The Log Forwarder is a box, it's a VM, which is used to relay Syslog information from sources which support Syslog to Azure Sentinel. On its left side, it listens to Syslog traffic over port 514. By default, it supports UDP and TCP. It can configure to support TLS also. I'll say a word about it later on. And on the right side, whatever it receives, it will send over the public internet, unless you use one of the options I mentioned before, to using an entirely private network, over encrypted HTTPS traffic to the Azure Sentinel workspace. Inside the box, what you have is two services which serve together to provide this capability. One of them would be the log analytics agent, which I mentioned before can also be installed on an endpoint, on a server or workstation, alongside a Syslog server. We support two Rsyslog and Syslog NG. In this presentation today, I'll focus entirely on Rsyslog. Everything I'll say can be converted to Syslog NG. It requires a bit of work, probably another blog article or webinar. In between the two, and that's something that we'll discuss in some length later on, Rsyslog D is listening to external traffic on port 514, can process the information. We'll talk a lot about this processing. The filtering example that I'll show today is based on Rsyslog filtering. And then it relays the information to the log analytics agent. It relays over TCP port 25226 CEF information, CEF events, and it relays over port UDP 25224 Syslog information. Using UDP is not ideal. It's something that we are looking into changing, but as long as we did not change that, I'm trying to change the color of the pen. I'm tired of red. I'll show you today how to change Syslog from UDP to TCP yourself. I'm talking about CEF and Syslog without differentiating Syslog, CEF. What's the difference? Let's look into that. So Syslog, as you can see above, is a network protocol which is used to send events. Syslog is mostly a free-form text-based protocol. Everything up to, I believe here, is a header, which includes a few pieces of information, essentially a timestamp and a host name, and importantly, a facility and a severity indicator. And on the right side, there is the text message. However, the text message is not formatted in any manner. When it gets, and you'll see here that the example on the bottom is not the one on the top, but I want it to be conformant with CEF. If you send CEF as Syslog, which is doable, as I mentioned, if you send it over port 25224, you'll receive in the Syslog message field in the Syslog table just a long string. Whatever you send. It's very, very flexible because it means that any type of information can be sent. It doesn't have to conform to any schema within the Sentinel workspace, but you'll need to learn what to do with it. On the other hand, the CEF send message is using over the same Syslog protocol, having the same Syslog header. Notice that until here, it's roughly the same. Difference being the format of the timestamp, a formatted text message. So the right side is formatted in a well-defined format that includes fields and values, and therefore we are able, if you see, if the custom string one is my test, we can have device custom string one here is my test. So we can make sure that when we get CEF information in Sentinel, we populate the common security log table with the data and the right fields, which makes the data a lot more useful. Therefore, if your source is using CEF, it's much better to send the data as CEF to the log forwarder. And the log forwarder will identify itself and will make sure it gets to Sentinel and is parsed correctly and fields are put in the right place. That said, if you do send Syslog, that's not the end of the world. You can parse this Syslog Syslog message field at query time and build queries which are very intelligent and use fields, even if it was not parsed at ingest time. Here you can see an example which is actually available in the GitHub, in Azure Sentinel GitHub, of a Squid proxy parser. Squid proxy sends events in the Syslog format. It does not support CEF. And by deploying this parser, you can have a well structured format of events to analyze. You can see here that the parser is just a query. The query takes the Syslog table here. I probably need a different color now that actually probably better to use the highlighter. So it checks that the process name is Squid. So it filters only for the Squid events from the Syslog table that might get more. And then it one by one extract values from the Syslog message into name fields, getting all the data that's useful from a Squid Syslog message. How do you actually use this one? How do I remember that? How is it there? So the way to use such a parser is to save it as a log analytics function. If you save this query as the Squid logs function, you'll be able to use it just as if it was a table. So by creating such a parser, even if you did not parse the information before it got to Sentinel, you still have, you think of the data as if it was parsed, even though it's parsed at runtime as part of your query. Use field names in your query, and you don't have to know anything about the parser. So Syslog is not a blocker, but CEF saves you time. It means you don't need such a parser. If you go to our GitHub, you'll see that we are starting to have more and more parser for Syslog sources. For example, recently we introduced an Infoblox Syslog parser, and there are a few others. That's the one I remember. So that was the Azure Sentinel Log Forwarder VM. I discussed its structure, CEF versus Syslog, etc. Before we move on, if I did mention that, it's important to note that this log forwarder box or VM is a Linux box. We support different variants of Linux. You have flexibility around that, but it does mean Linux. So I wanted to share a few tips around working with Linux. Some of them are valuable only when you use for experimenting, developing, and some are useful anyways, also for production system. So the first one is that it's very easy these days to just get yourself a Linux box on your desktop. If you go to your Hyper-V manager, just run it. It's available, I think, on every Windows 10 system. Then you do actions quick create. You actually get out of the box the option to install Ubuntu Linux systems and get a virtual machine running Linux. Depending on your download speed, you'll get a Linux box in minutes. Now, you may think that Linux is, frightening, hard. There is a learning curve there. That said, if I'll go to, and I'll do it now through, I'm going to a VM which is not local. It's actually, I access it through a RDP on the server that I'm using here. You'll see that this log forwarder VM that we'll use a lot today has quite a nice Windows interface, and you will see later that we talk about Rsyslog D files. We can go to each one of those and we can edit them here in a pretty useful editor, and it's not that different than what you're used to. So maybe, getting into Linux is worthwhile. The two other tools I want to mention are, first of all, mRemote-ng, which I'm using here. You may know it because it's also useful for managing multiple RDP sessions if you are a system administrator, but it also supports very nicely a Linux command line, which is called SSH in this case. That's a very good example. Keep in mind that Linux is case sensitive. Anyways, so I'm using mRemote-ng a lot as a way to connect to the server and work. We'll see the commands that I have to issue a bit later on. And the last but not least is actually pretty neat. I actually discovered it for this webinar. So I'll just go into there. I mentioned you can create your Linux box very easily. Before I get later, the one thing you need in order to do SSH and in order to work with your server, send events to it, is to get or set the IP address. The commands here, I will not dive deep into them, will get you the automatic DHCP assigned IP address that the system will get if it's just an Hyper-V system on your computer. Very useful. A slightly different set will be used in production when you want to actually assign a static IP address to your log forwarder server. You also may need to enable SSH to remotely log in. For those who don't know, sudo is the equivalent in the Linux world to start as administrator in the Windows world. The first time you run a sudo-based command line in a session, it will ask you for a password, and next it will not, and will enable you to run elevated prompt commands. apt is the Ubuntu add components program, and I will not dive into the rest here. The last trick I really want to share with you is this one. I found out that whatever I showed you until now was just basic installing a system, reading a command line. What people really hate about Linux is editing. especially if you go through the command line and you don't have a desktop interface. And the instructions that are linked here on the left enable you to deploy a device driver on your Windows machine that can use the same SSH interface. So no new ports, no changes on the Linux side, to map files. And you see here on the running video on the right, the mapping action. I can show you how it looks like on my system. So here you see I have essentially a Windows machine, a Linux folder tree in front of me. It is the configuration path for those who don't know that, etc. And it enables a very easy way to edit files. How do you actually edit them? Make sure that you use Notepad++ because it knows how to maintain the Linux end-of-line marks. I added a few more tips and tricks to the slides themselves. Review them when you go through the slides. I just want to mention that with a bit of giving you an afternoon, working with a Linux machine is not the end of the world. And again, for those who are Linux buffs, and I'm old enough to have started with Linux, sorry for the last few minutes. I hope it was helpful for the others. And actually, the SSH mapping may be useful to everyone. I do want to mention that this is not a production setup. When you want to have a log forwarder, which is a production log forwarder, you have to mind a few areas. First of all, it's a Linux server. You'll have to harden it, which does require that the organization know how to harden and manage Linux machines. Maybe something that we'll discuss in a different opportunity. There's also fault tolerance and scaling. We do quite a lot. Again, a topic I covered in the past of event flow, events per second in a single system, because we don't do a lot of processing. The parsing is done in the cloud. Still, sometimes you need more than one system, so you need a way to scale things up. We have a solution using Azure technology that uses a VM scale set and Azure load balancer to scale when collecting, when the log forwarder cluster is in the cloud. You'll need something else if you do it on on-prem. So now you have a Linux machine installed. You know how to access it. You want to install the log forwarder. Of everything in this presentation, this is the simplest part. We really made installing the log forwarder a snap. There is one prerequisite. You'll need Python to be installed on your system. That's not exactly true. That's the only prerequisite you need on an Ubuntu system. On a Red Hat or CentOS system and some others, you may also have to install Rsyslog or Syslog NG themselves. Rsyslog is the one I'm using here. It would be a very similar install. It's a standard module for those systems. It's just not part of the initial install. So you have to use their installation command. It's not apt. apt is the Ubuntu version. And then you'll have, in this case, you just have to install Python using sudo apt install Python. You'll be able then to check that Python is available and get the version number. By the way, notice that even the command line in Linux is pretty helpful these days. While Python was not found, it did say what to do. Today we need Python 2. It's just for installation script. Something to keep in mind. What else? The next part is actually a bit interesting because in the Sentinel UI, and it's a good time to get to Sentinel UI for the first time. In the connectors page, if I'll do here common security format. If I go to the instructions, you'll get here the command to run, and you'll be asked to copy it to the clipboard. Why is that important? Why would you want the command from here, not from the documentation? I'll paste the command into Notepad++, which is the editor that I'm using. It's larger so you can see stuff. You'll see that, and I just recorded my personal, it's a demo tenant. I'll probably have to scratch it and start again, since this will be publicly available. The information about the workspace and how to access it is embedded in the command line. So you don't have to think about it. You just deploy it. I will not do it now because I have the agent already installed. You just copy it here, right click. We'll see it later, copies to the command line. It will go and install for you the log forwarder. You'll make all the changes required to the machine in order to work as a log forwarder. And that's actually all that you need. This is roughly how the commands look like. I already had it. I'll have to scratch the workspace and create a new one. Homework for tonight. And there'll be a lot of lines here, and then at the end, the installation completed. There might be errors. I have encountered one or two in that and that installations, but in many times it's just a missing component. For example, our Syslog is missing, and many are clearly articulated. And if not, we are happy to get a support call and make sure that our scripts are articulated better. Now you have the system installed. How do you know that it works? What do you do next? So there's a bit of troubleshooting that can be done. Troubleshooting is not important just for the sake of checking whether the install did work. Also, in the next step, we'll start hacking and changing configuration files, and then you want troubleshooting to test that your changes did work. So let's look at a few of the options here. So the first one is there is a validation script, which is referenced from the same data connector page that we looked before. It does a few checks. For example, you'll see that everything that was supposed to be installed was installed. So if there's something unexpected in the installation script and it said it did succeed, but it didn't, that will catch that. It also checks a specific item we've identified where the default OS firewall is blocking your ports and is not making log forwarding possible. Secondly, you may want to send a test message. The logger command on the command line. I'll copy it here and I'll use it. Keep annotations. Did I want to keep them? I don't know. I can take the logger command as is here, go to the command line here, and then that's the wrong one. Hint Control U deletes a line. Why didn't that work for me? Oh, that works fine. This should send a CEF message to the workspace. We'll see if you will not go and check that now, though we'll see my test when I'll check for others later on. I'll do the demo when I go to actual filtering in a few minutes. So this command will do the test for you. And we'll send, we can actually probably go to the workspace. Why is it always the, no, that's not the right one. To the workspace, go to the log screen and go to common security log, order by descending and see if we got one recently. So I think 339 is the relevant one. Yeah, I think that's the one I send now. What we can do here in order to know is a project. I'll need it anyway in a second. Time generated, user, username, and device, custom string. Yeah, and this is the one I just sent with my test. You can see that because you can see that I sent custom string 1 as my test. In general, you'll notice that in order to, when you develop things, you'll send a lot of messages. What I do is I always variate the CS1 string, so it's a new value, so it's easier for me to identify if something was changed. One more command to know is rsyslog d -n. The reason is that we are going to change rsyslog d configuration, and if we do that, we want to check before we restart the service that the configuration file is correct. And is the level of check. I never know why change number 5 works for me. So you see now it's all fine. If I'll go now here to one of the configuration files and change here to say just that, doesn't work well. And by the way, notice I edited on Windows a file that resided on the Linux box, and yeah, you see it doesn't work. Error messages, pretty nice ones. They explain well stuff, and they show that the thing is not correct. So that was troubleshooting. Now, for the last few minutes, we have all the tools in order to understand how to supercharge a configuration file, including filtering events before they reach their workspace. We have all the building blocks connected. Let's go. So, how are the rsyslog configuration files structured? The main one is /etc/rsyslog.conf. It's a general configuration file, and it's the one in which the installation script enables listening to port 514 for TCP and UDP so that you can send your Syslog and CEF events from source devices. This one is mostly what we need. If you get very advanced, you can of course get there and try to see if there are things you want to change. One thing that rsyslog.conf does, it includes all files which are located in /etc/rsyslog.d as additional include configuration file. They do most of the selection and forwarding of events to different destinations, whether those are the log analytics agent, you remember, on port 25224 or 25226, which means that it will be sent forward to Sentinel, or it might be to a file, or it might be to another Syslog server. After you install a plain vanilla log forwarder using the installation script, you'll have all the 4 files on the right. Here, we'll rebuild. We'll make a few changes that will enable you to do filtering. One thing to remember, I did not get deeper in this talk about that in this webinar, is the 2 last files, 95-OMS agent and security config OMS agent, are part of the log forwarder installation. 20 and 50 are default, in this case Ubuntu Syslog configuration files. They are mostly fine. They will mean that the Syslog messages that you send to the server are also logged locally in a file. It's a pretty good backup solution. The default should be fine and should allow you to, it's not a large buffer. And it uses log rotate in order to make sure that it doesn't grow forever and never and just locks the disk. That said, if the disk is small, if the configuration does not fit the disk size, it may blow, and then you have to play with the log rotate facility in order to change rotation, number of historical versions, or just avoid writing to files the syslog or CEF messages. Not something I talked about here. Maybe the information I'll provide in a second will help you do that. The first thing that we'll do, which will help us in two ways, would be to replace the security config omsagent.conf file with a file called 60-cef. Guys, a mistake.conf, of course. Why? The configuration files are done in order, and the change that we'll introduce here to facilitate filtering, we want it to be before the file 95.-oms agent. So we want to make sure that we call it a lower number. That's the first reason. That's the reason. It will ensure that CEF and Syslog work flawlessly together. The line that we'll put in this file would be the two lines below. I have them also already here in the file. What do? They check if the raw message contains CEF or ASA, which is a Cisco ASA event stream that we handle as CEF, and then forwards them to the log analytics agent in port 25226. In addition, it also stops handling them. It means that after that, all those events are forwarded, but are not continued to be handled, and therefore are not handled by the syslog configuration below. That's very important. Next, we can go into filtering. For filtering, we'll create a file called 55.filter. I'll add the .conf later on. I see that I made a mistake here twice again. And in this file, we can use any valid Rsyslog condition with a stop action to drop the events and filter them out. There are a few examples here. We'll use the first one as the example. The first, second, and third do roughly the same. The importance of the second and third are more accurate. They make sure that not just we filter for every user that is we don't just filter for any user which is a service user, we also make sure that it's a CEF event. So because S user is meaningful in the concept of a CEF event, so we don't just get a random syslog event that's unrelated. The first option, as you can see, avoids that. You can see a few options here that are different. The first one uses contains, which is a substring. Second one uses a regular expression, so a much more versatile option to do exclusions. The third one uses a full range of conditional expressions with and or, with the operators being anything you want in between. The last example is a real world one, which is one that wants to minimize the type of Cisco ASA events which are sent to the log to Azure Sentinel. All of them are easy to variate based on your requirement. You see events, you get too many in Azure Sentinel, you go, you update file 55-filter.conf, and you don't get those events anymore. Let's see it actually working. So I actually prepared here a 55-filter.conf file that does the first thing. So it actually filters out service accounts, assuming that SVC- is the starting point for service accounts in your environment. I'll go back to, I can check here, by the way, /etc, just that you'll see that it's the same files, Rsyslog D, and then 55. You see, that's exactly the file. It's a bit small, and there is no, I can do that to make it larger. So now you can see it's larger. I'll now go and do the checking that I mentioned is important. And we see they're fine. I also make sure that those files are the relevant ones. I'll do service I'll restart the service. If you think about the commands are pretty similar to the UI version in Windows, and if you know your command in Windows the same. And now we'll go and check. To check what we want to do is again use the logger command that I have somewhere here above. I'll now change the CS1 to do webinar demo. And I'll start with user Smith, or I'll do offer. So that's one. And then I'll try another one with SVC dash offer Syslog. We'll go and spend 2 minutes on the following slide or two, and then I'll go back and check the workspace to see what we got. So those are the filters. You know, I had a lot of background, but the filtering itself is super easy. The last thing I want to chat about is a fix, something we want to make sure is actually available for every installation of the log forwarder. Today you have to fix it. CEF works using TCP in between the two elements in the log forwarder. Syslog is using UDP, which is not as recommended. In order to use TCP, you'll have to go through the process described here. First, you'll have to go and select the facilities and severities you want to collect using Syslog. That's the standard way to control a Syslog collection in Azure Sentinel. This actually changes the file you see here on the right. So this actually changes this file here. When you change things in the portal, it changes things here. So you get a file that has the right events that you want to collect. The next thing you'll have to do would be to run this command. This command disconnects the workspace settings from the agent so that further changes to the workspace will not be reflected because we're going to change this file. We don't want the system to control it remotely. Now we can go to the two files listed here in 3 and change in both to TCP. Here UDP to TCP, and here each time we have a single alpha into a double alpha, which implies TCP. It's an important change to be made. If you follow the webinar so far, you know that you can avoid all that entirely. You can always go into disabling central control and control all your forwarding using your own expressions, saying file 70-syslog. It might be a good idea, actually. It might be a material for a next webinar. Now, before we go to a few minutes of questions, let's go to the workspace and let's hope that we don't get the usual. And let's run the query again. In the query, I selected specific fields to make it easier to see what actually appeared. And you see that in the webinar demo, I sent 2 strings, but only one of them received here. Offer Shazaf, the source username, is here, but SVC-offer Shazaf is not here, which was just what I wanted to filter. So, luckily, a successful demo. With that, I think that we are ending this webinar, and it's a good time for questions.
Perfect. Behind the scene, I was copying all the questions and I was uploading them on the poll EV, and the folks are already there adding new ones or even upvoting or downvoting. So let me share that and see what's going on, and then Offer, you can take it from there. Okay, I believe I'm sharing now.
So it's a very good tool. It enables you to read through a lot of questions that you voted for up front. I will pick those that I feel are more relevant for this webinar. It doesn't mean the others are not good. It just means that I'll answer them later. Anyway, the first one is a great one. Now the first one. Yes, the answer is you can send any CEF or Syslog source to Sentinel using exactly the same method described. Actually, the connector is described as a generic CEF connector in Sentinel. It does not have to be in the list of specific CEF connectors that are in Azure Sentinel. It's important enough that I actually want to go to the documentation page and show it to you. The way we did it is that there are instructions for CEF that are not specific to any solution. We do have more options. I'm not showing, you're showing. Sorry guys, that's the challenge with the way we work. I'll skip that and I'll go back to the answers. Anyways, so you missed my presentation now, but the idea is, yes, you can connect any CEF source, any source that supports CEF or Syslog to Sentinel. So, to your question about using the same log forwarder for CEF and Syslog. As deployed by default, you can use the same server for both CEF and Syslog. You have to be careful about facilities as noted in the question. However, if you use the change I suggested in this webinar, specifically the change to change the OMS security.com file into 60-CEF and add to it the content I presented, you will be able to use both CEF and Syslog with no restrictions. We hope to introduce that into the agent natively, into the log forwarder natively in the near future.
Ofer, if you can hear me, we're getting some static on your side. So try it again. It's not working. Okay, Ofer, we cannot hear you well. We're still getting some static. We're getting close here to the end, so I'll just wrap it up here. And so just some reminders before ending the call. As most of you are known with the Sentinel webinars, or in general security webinars, all of them can be located. The next ones, that is at aka.ms/security webinars. This is also the location where we keep our recordings as well as the decks for the previous webinars. And you can also, the same page, you can also visit and register for the upcoming ones. In case we missed to answer your question, or if you have additional questions, you can visit us on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. However, for some of you that were at the beginning of the call, Ofer had mentioned that he'll be wrapping up into his last slide of the deck all the answers to the questions that were not provided here during the call. And having that said, I would like to close this webinar by thanking Ofer for another fantastic presentation. And thank you to the rest of the team who helped with questions. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. And we apologize for this small glitch here that we had with the audio. Hopefully the next one, hopefully it will not be repeated with the next one. Thank you so much again. We hope to see you next time, and goodbye.